Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Aotearoa me Taranaki, ko Alice Te Punga Somerville lahau. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between, you know, the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and tāna whalawa. I'm really excited to introduce the Taualuga series of Writing the New World podcast, featuring the project leader and visionary Associate Professor Alice Te Punga Somerville. This is the first of 3 Taualuga series in this podcast. In this podcast, episode 14, Alice talks about the inspiration, the conceptual framing of the project, the whakapapa of intellectual thought, and the thrills in particular that she has found in the hiring, retention, and provision of scholarships for researchers under this project. Whawhetai tere lava to Associate Professor Alice Te Punga Somerville for the incredible opportunities she has provided Indigenous researchers to conduct research for and with our own communities. Whakalonga mai and enjoy.
I'm a researcher here at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and 3 years ago I started on a journey which in many ways I'd already been on, but it was a new stage for me in the journey. I got some Marsden research funding to do a project that I had pitched to them, to the Royal Society, called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. I was quite excited about the research funding being approved, partly because it's really nice to get research funding because it means you can do things like hire people and go travelling and these sorts of things and turn a little dream into an actual thing. But also I had just moved home to Aotearoa, carrying my first child, Te Tilia, and so my sense of coming home, taking up a job at Waikato, having baby here in Aotearoa, was then kind of joined really by the sense of kind of affirmation that I had something to contribute to the New Zealand research community, which is how that research funding felt, like, yes, this project matters here. So the project emerged in many ways from me being a total brat, which is something which has been a marker of my entire academic journey and perhaps my life. I keep running away from Aotearoa. I ran away to do my PhD. I moved over to the States just before my 25th birthday and came back and took up a job at Victoria University of Wellington just before I turned 30. So I got my PhD from a school in the States, from Cornell, having spent 1 year of that journey also based at University of Hawaii at Manoa. So I came home with a sense that I was coming home forever, and forever lasted for about 7 years, and then I ran away again. I had a sabbatical at the University of Toronto, and then a job came up to teach Pacific literature at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a place I had continued to deepen my connection with, and a place that I feel pretty connected to, even though I'm no longer there. I had that job for 2 years before moving to Australia for really practical kind of visa related purposes. It was hard for my husband and I to stay in the US, and so we moved to Australia, where I had opportunities to reconnect with the Māori diaspora in Australia, but also to think again about what kinds of work you can do when you look at the Pacific from different parts of the region. What does the Pacific look like from Hawaii? What does the Pacific look like from Australia? And then eventually, as I said 3 years ago, what does the Pacific look like from here? While I was in Australia, I was at a Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and I got an email one day from someone called Mark Williams, who's a very senior scholar in New Zealand literary studies, and he was editing a fancy important book, the either Cambridge or Oxford history of New Zealand literature, and he asked me if I would do a chapter on Te Ao Hau, which was a New Zealand government publication which came out between the early 1950s and 1975, and to be completely honest with you, I had no interest in doing it, and I was a complete martyr to the cause, and I thought, well, I'm not interested at all in Te Ao Hau, but because I'm a nice person and I love my people, I will deign to do this incredibly boring job of writing about this stupid magazine that I have no interest in writing about at all. Anyway, of course, the joke was on me, because here we go, I'm still writing about that particular magazine. And I spent a really transformative couple of months reading Te Ao Hau, which is freely available through the New Zealand National Library website. You can just Google Te Ao Hau and there you are. It's all freely available. It's all digitised. You can search, see if any of your relations have written anything in there by searching through it. It's a really incredible resource. So I spent a couple of months in Sydney reading my way through that magazine, and it came out a few times a year. Through a period of time that we kind of know instinctively as Māori was a time of massive change. It's often thought of as a time of massive loss. It's kind of the post-war period when things were something, and then we get to the mid-70s, by which time things were something else. And this kind of tracked that. Of course, I'm not the first person. I'm not Christopher Columbus. I don't believe I'm the first person that ever read Te Ao Hau. But I was asked to do it as a literary scholar. And for that, I'll always thank Mark Williams, actually, for seeing that this was an important thing to do, and for thinking of asking me to write that chapter. They actually have a crossword at the back of each of the issues of Te Ao Hau, which is like a Te Reo Māori crossword, and it's like a translation one, just to like practice your reo. So there'll be like 5, and the answer will be rima or whatever. And so I would literally print off the crossword, and then when I would trot over to have my coffee or my lunch at the food court on campus, I would like work my way through my crossword. So Te Ao Hau in many ways was affirming for me as a Māori person living in Australia at the time. Someone who at that point, to be honest, was not that interested in moving home, but who as a Māori person felt very nurtured by having an opportunity to connect with our language and also with the people, and I keep being blown away by all the writing in there. And one of the things that I kept being blown away by was the sense that all of this writing had been done by Māori people before the firsts of Māori literature. And I don't believe that the firsts, Witi Ihimaera, Patricia Grace, Hone Tūwhare, these are the sort of names that come up as the firsts. I don't believe any of them have themselves attempted to evacuate the time before them. And in fact, in Witi Ihimaera's recent autobiography, he actually talks about the way that he very much had a sense of being kind of a younger writer coming into a scene that was already, full to the brim of people like Rore Hapipi and Hone Tūwhare and so on. And yet we still do have these pretty strong stories that we tell ourselves. And these strong stories that we tell ourselves here, but I was writing this while I was teaching a paper, they call it a unit in Australia to be exciting, a unit called Indigenous Australian Literature. And this is also a really strong story in Australia, is that, this idea that Aboriginal writing kind of happened suddenly in the 70s. It's also a strong story in Hawaii. It's a strong story actually all around the Indigenous world, certainly all around the Pacific world. Albert Wendt appeared, Witi Ihimaera appeared, Patricia Grace appeared, Ujuru Nunakal appeared. These people kind of popped out as if from nowhere. And of course historians know that our people have been writing and so on, but people from my disciplines, from literary studies, hadn't really engaged with that stuff at all. And I became curious to know just how much we didn't know and what there was to know, how many writers were out there. One of the things about Te Ao Hau is that it's not novels. There's some poetry in there, but they're not collected as books of poems, and so it doesn't really get a lot of airplay in English departments because it doesn't appear to be Māori literature. They don't really talk about it that much in media studies because media studies tends to not do as much of that kind of historical work or kind of tracing that stuff coming through. Really it's left to those of us, now that I'm more fully in Indigenous studies and Pacific studies disciplinarily, it's those of us in these interdisciplinary spaces that are going to be kind of asking these questions, because the genres that people are writing in, especially thinking about non-fiction, memoir, letters to the editor, whakapapa, korero from back in the days, who's gonna talk about them? And the answer to that is Indigenous studies and Pacific studies. That's who's going to talk about them. The other reason I think we hadn't been looking at this work, and it's not that everyone had been like, oh my gosh, we can't talk about Te Ao Hau, that's like really dumb, who would do that? Even though that was what I thought when I was asked to write the chapter. But it's just that everyone's busy doing other jobs, right? Everyone's really stretched and doing things. So it's not that I'm grumpy at people for having not done the work, but it is that I think it's important to express just how much work there is to be done and how much we can benefit and be nurtured and sustained by connecting with our writing traditions from before the 1970s. So there are a couple of other reasons that I think a lot of people hadn't been writing about the kinds of things that we look at in the project, Writing the New World. One of them is that a lot of this writing, published writing, so I'm not talking about like letters, manuscripts, whakapapa books and all that. That's all unpublished stuff. That's like can of worms, another whole, not just talk show, but another whole like channel, right? Like that's massive. I'm just talking about the published stuff. And one of the reasons that's important to me is that the published stuff, the writers have made a decision at some point that this would actually have a public audience, a readership, and I think that there are different kinds of questions for us to ask ourselves if we're going to be dealing with the writing of people who are really writing to an individual or to a particular whānau. I think that's when there are really important questions around who's the right person to do this research. When it comes to published writing, I think, this person had the intention that it would be read widely, and so I really respond to that intention by saying, thank you, I'd love to read your work. But a lot of this stuff has really been published in periodicals. Periodicals are magazines, newspapers, journals, sometimes of associations, churches, organisations, and some of them of the state. Some of them feel very colonial as journals or magazines or institutions, and some of them really don't. They're like activist journals and speaking back and so on. So periodicals are something that my project is really interested in, right? Like how do we make sense of, and how do we find, and how do we even track down, because heaps of these things aren't really held by particular libraries. They might have a little bit of the jigsaw here or a little bit there. There are very few periodicals that Māori have published in consistently, like Te Ao Hou, which is now, you know, freely available online. Most of them, you know, it's a case of running into the back rooms of the archives and digging up things that we didn't expect to, you know, to find there. But one of the other things which has become, I guess, a new thought for me, or a kind of a deeper consideration for me as a scholar, through this project, has been the idea of our writing being in many, many languages. And one of the things that's really important for me about that is that one person can't do all the jobs. I am horrendously monolingual when it comes to being able to do analytical work. I'm really only able to function in English. You know, I can order a coffee in Māori, but unfortunately there's not that many people ordering flat whites in Te Ao Hou, and so I have to satisfy myself with getting other people to do that work. So, so one of the things that becomes really important is the collective, collaborative nature of research, and the need for more and more researchers who have linguistic and cultural skills to come in and do this kind of work. What's been really exciting has been the kind of 16 different Indigenous researchers that have come with a whole range of different skills. Not all of them are speakers of their language, not all of them feel like they're kind of cultural brokers, not all of them feel like they can speak on behalf of their communities in particular ways, but they all come from across the spectrum in terms of linguistic ability, and the project has really caused me to grapple with what we're doing in the university sector around developing and encouraging and nurturing and rewarding and providing scholarships for and hiring and retaining people, students then to become scholars with these skills in Indigenous languages. There are archives out there groaning with published work written by our people just needing to be read. And on one level, a Noelani Arista, a Hawaiian historian, sort of writes about this in relation to the Hawaiian archive, you know, but it's so important for us all to think about, I think, which is, it's a little bit ridiculous to think that you can account for the thought or history or ideas of a people if you're only engaging with that people through, in my case, English language archives, if the people themselves have expressed their thought, their perspectives, their ideas in archives that are published in languages other than English. I mean, it seems like it should be like a little bit of a no-brainer, but how can we actually ethically continue to do this work? I don't think the answer is for me to go off and learn the more than 1,200 languages that are Indigenous to the Pacific region. The answer may not even be for me to go off and learn, although I would love to, and it's a priority for me on some level, on personal level. I don't think the answer here is for me to rush off and learn Te Reo Māori so I can now go and replicate the work that other Reo Māori people are able to do. I think the question for me becomes, you know, we can so easily individualise this stuff and be like, oh, I have to be able to do this. I need to be able to learn Māori so I can read the other stuff in Te Ao that's in Māori. I need to learn Māori so I can read all these other texts in Te Reo. Or maybe I use my power within the institution to encourage and nurture and bring people through who can do that work. Maybe there's a danger in it being a bit ego-driven, and maybe there's something really important about thinking about this being a collective work. So thinking about the way that we can learn from this this work in the archives, right? So the idea that it's not just that I'm sitting here having my I'm trying to decolonize my methodology, and then I'm going to do this whole new thing. I'm going to indigenize my way of engaging with the archive. It's going to be very cool, and then I'm going to go and still kind of engage with the archive as almost products. You know, like, oh, here's an item. Oh, look at me in my decolonized self. I have acquired a poem written by someone. Isn't that cool? But instead of that, really thinking about intergenerational critical work. So one of the things which I think has become really overwhelmingly important to me is the expansion of our critical bookshelves to include the critical work that our people have done, have published over a long period of time. I think the danger is that we all read the same, three critical books that were published in the 21st century, right, or just before, and we don't end up kind of going, well, we don't even assume like, oh, maybe there was someone writing about this in a random publication coming out of Fiji in 1950. Maybe there was actually a critical article about this, right? So although as a literary scholar, my kind of first move has been the creative work, and my next move has been, and other stuff in periodicals kind of broadly, what I kind of thought that would mean would be kind of ethnographic stuff, memoir, non-fiction, stuff about things, right? But one of the things which I have loved about this project has been the amount of critical work that our people have been doing, including about how to do research, including about methodology, including about theory, including, right, that we've actually been doing that for decades and decades, and so what I want to now do is actually kind of rush into my classrooms and be like, there's all these essays we haven't been reading, there are whole generations of scholars whose critical work we haven't engaged. Now, as a literary scholar, I'm very happy to make the argument that a poem is also a critical work and and yes, absolutely, critical work takes many forms, and yes, the creative stuff can be critical and blah, 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 I'm so there with those arguments. But we actually also have these, explicitly critical work. We have, work where members of our communities have written about scholarly things in scholarly journals that we don't read. Yeah, and this to me is a great loss. And the thing for me in the academy is, you can run around and tell people, oh man, in the academy you're so white, you're so monocultural, and the academy always has the same answer. Oh, it's capacity issues. We don't hire anyone because there's no one out there who has the right training or degree or da-da-da. If there was someone there, we would hire them. I've heard this my entire academic career. It's not true in any discipline anymore. It's just a lie people want to tell themselves to justify why the departments look the same way they did 50 years ago. Capacity issues we can extend, right, to this idea of, why does the academy, why does the bookshelf, why does the collective bookshelf look like this, right? That we have not just had capacity to hire people, but we have been doing this critical labour, this hard work, producing, you have a look at some of these, this critical writing, these journals that have been put out. It's hard work in a place like Fiji in the 70s to have the money to produce, the time, the typesetting, the whatever, to produce these really amazing critical journals. Excuse me. But I think that for me is kind of one of the other places that we can go. So one of the things for the project for me, excuse me, that I've been so excited about has been the ability to think about the up-and-coming scholars, and the potential. What would happen if every lecturer at every university looked at all the brown students in the room and went, you guys, you can really bring something to the academy and to your communities, and these don't have to be the opposite of each other, right? That's the future academy, that's the current, that's the amazing crop of people who are featured in our podcast, that's that. But there's another missing generation of scholars, and those are the ones who have already been, right? Some of whom are now only understood really as kind of cultural icons, and we haven't actually read it's like, hello, this person is not just a cultural icon, receptacle of culture, repository of amazingness, no, the reo and the tikanga from wherever they come from. They've actually also published these journal articles, right? So one of the things for me is there's a challenge that this project I think puts out there, which is not just about what can the academy be, what can research look like, what have our people been writing, but also what are the stakes of the things that we've already forgotten. And how do we make sure that we correct our memories, that we remember, we find, we track down, we remember, we acknowledge, we learn from, we intellectually engage with the work that our people have already done. To me, that shifts the academy that I work in. I no longer work in a white university, right? I work in a context where the academy, universities, our communities have been doing this work, this thinking, and my job is just to do my little bit in this really interconnected, intergenerational, multilingual whakapapa of intellectual thought of the region. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Alice. Okay, that's wonderful. That's really powerful. What opportunities the language weeks provide?
So the language weeks, Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori obviously has been going for decades now. If we go back to when it was Māori Language Day, which then became a week after a few years, the Māori Language Week's as old as me, perhaps ish around that era. So it's been going for a long time, and then obviously one of the things that happened in New Zealand was more recently the kind of development of Pacific Language Weeks. And then there are also some other languages that I understand, some other communities are like, oh, let's have a Chinese Language Week or whatever as well. And I think that's really important. One of the things that I think, hopefully we would all agree on is that, the importance and significance of language. And one of the things that we as New Zealand Māori have learned, and don't wish others to learn the way that we've learned it, is it's much easier to lose a language than it is to get it back. Yeah, it just takes one generation to lose a language, but getting it back takes 2-3 generations. Yeah, and so the language weeks provide an opportunity for our communities, first and foremost, to have those really important, sometimes difficult conversations. In addition, the language weeks provide an opportunity for institutions to think about how they're responding to the multilingual realities of the people that are part of those institutions. And for universities, staff, students, right? My fear is that the language weeks become culture weeks, which is not to say that language isn't culture, but it is to say that in a university, what I would like is for universities in Māori and Pacific Language Weeks to profile and celebrate what we do in universities, intellectual work and teaching that can happen and should happen in our languages. That to me is different than saying, oh, we're celebrating, to pick on you, Wanda, Samoan Language Week, to pick on you, Ammon, and myself, Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori. We're going to celebrate that by doing some Māori things or doing some Samoan things. We can do that. But I would like it to be that institutions such as universities and maybe government institutions can think about what it means in their context and other community organisations. Okay, cool, but it's not just like the language week is code for, oh, you're going to do that thing that once that week that seems connected to the culture because that's cool, which might be fine, but they're actually really going to think carefully about what is the place and what is the potential contribution of this language to our kind of core business, to use a dumb term, yeah? So what is the potential? So what's important to me is that we in the university context think about and practice and demonstrate and promote and celebrate Māori and Pacific Language Weeks as an opportunity to go intellectual work, the work of the academy, happens and can happen and should happen more in this language. The work of the project connects with that because it demonstrates it has already been happening. We have already been doing the work of the academy in our languages, and what opportunities we have as in 2020 as universities, as researchers, to continue the work that our people have already been doing.
That was really awesome.
I obviously knew what it was about, and it started with Chao Ho and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't know all the sort of context stuff of leading up to it and how it developed and growth. So that was actually really interesting for me, just to what I'm a part of. It was cool. Yeah.
I do have one question though, and it's you don't have to answer it. But it was about.
I'm nervous.
I know.
So in terms of, we talk a lot about connections, and the core part of the project itself is centering Indigenous voices. And I know this is what you were highlighting in your book, Once We Were Pacific. So can you tell us how this project itself connected to your book that you wrote?
Yeah, so we can trace a kind of longer genealogy of this project before the Mark Williams asking me to write about Te Aohau. And one of the kind of key places that would have to go through is actually my former Marsden-funded project, which was called Once We're Pacific, where I was really interested in thinking about Māori connections with the rest of the region. And that project was kind of the first thing I did post-PhD. So I got home and I was like, what's my first book project going to be? And that felt like the right one. And it was partly because I grew up a Māori person in a big neighbourhood in Auckland, and I found that a lot of the narratives that I was hearing about what it was to be Māori were narratives that were about the kind of broadly discussed ones, and certainly the official ones, were about being Māori was about Māori people hanging out with other Māori people, or about Māori people hanging out, engaging with Pākehā. And actually, in the primary school I went to, everyone was either Māori or Pacific. So I was like, there's like a whole lot of us as Māori who have an experience of growing up with Pacific communities. And I don't mean that in a kind of like, in that dodgy sense of like, well, there were Samoans in my, class when I was in Form 3, so, surely we've, by osmosis they've connected in some way. But, really thinking about what experiences of being Māori didn't feel like they were kind of being discussed in our broader conversations about what it was to be Māori. And also the kind of really uncomfortable stuff, because we like to talk about connection because that's like cool and positive. But the disconnection, like how do we think about like, why do we not talk about ourselves as Pacific? How do we make sense of the prejudices between Māori and Pacific communities? How do we find ways to talk to each other, Māori and Pasifika in New Zealand, when the Crown wants us to scrap over the same crumbs falling off the table? Yeah, and we're constantly dragged into this, that Pasifika people think Māori is taking their stuff, or Māori got that so we should get it, and then Māori people are like, well, why should they get it, because we're Māori, this is our land, and right? So, well, okay, so what's the thing that makes us so invested about kind of continually engaging over the scrap for the crumbs rather than the whole loaf is sitting on the table, let's just go for that one, shall we? And also we can have more interesting conversations than that. So my first book really was interested in talking about these kind of different texts, because that's kind of how I roll, as being text-based, disciplinarily. Different texts that kind of demonstrated different ways that Māori thought about being part of the region. And sometimes it was because they lived somewhere else in the region. People like Vanessa Wanera, even Patoa Nathan, even Te Rangi Hiroa. And sometimes it was because they lived in parts of New Zealand, like I did. And they kind of went, hey, there's a Pacific person in my neighbourhood and we have these connections or whatever. And also in my book I was interested to a small extent, although I realised that a lot of that work has to be done by Pacifica scholars and thinking about how Pacifica people were thinking about us as New Zealand Māori and what it meant to be here. So some of the kind of questions from that book I think do continue to animate the research that I do. After that book, what I found was there were kind of all of these Māori texts that we hadn't talked about. And I was like, oh, why aren't we talking about them? And there were quite a few that I bumped into, partly through that book and then partly as on the way while I was writing that book and then afterwards. So that kind of became its own project, which was called Ghostwriters, the Māori Books You've Never Read, which I have to go and hurry up and publish. Got the manuscript sitting on the laptop, need to do that one. But then one of the things that emerged was, of course, a lot of these ghostwriters, the Māori Books You've Never Read, was because we don't expect them to have published anything during this time period, right? So it's like, oh, why don't we read all these ones? Oh, it's because we think that nothing happened before with Te Ihi Maira, right? And so you can kind of trace this kind of interest. I guess in some ways I'm like the I'm like the stand up for the little guy person. I'm like, yeah, cool, we can talk about that, but what about these other, like how is that story preventing us from telling these other stories or from listening to these other voices? Yeah, so I think there's a connection there. The connection between Māori and Pacific, and the disconnections and the misconnections and the scrapping over the crumbs and the embarrassing stuff, which is kind of keep it in the family conversation, you know, by which I mean we don't need to reveal everything to every white supremacist out there. You know, like, I think that stuff methodologically remains a part of this project for me. And part of that for me is thinking about what does it mean for me as a Māori person to have a research project where I want the people involved in the research project to all be Indigenous, but to actually not all just be Māori, but to kind of think about this kind of broader whānau that we're a part of. The other thing is sort of methodologically thinking about how we can you know, normalise the idea of Māori and Pacific researchers working together on a project in New Zealand, because currently that's not normalised, it's not normal, it's very strange. We have our Māori projects here and we have our Pacific projects there, and it's for good reasons. I'm not saying that people that do it are terrible or, you know, to all the coloniser or anything like that, but there's also, I think, scope within our worlds. And this is scope that we see documented in these texts that actually New Zealand Māori people and Pacific Indigenous people from around the region have actually for a really long time recognised that there's some really cool collaborative work that can happen when we connect with each other. And so so why don't we just keep doing that? Yeah, so that's part of the nudge, of course, that comes from this research. To be like, man, they were doing this in the 50s. Why aren't we doing it now? Yeah.